Bonjour, bienvenue, my fellow historians. Brian here. Imagine waking up in a golden bedchamber to a crowd of servants competing for the honor of tying your shoes, with a constant parade of lords and ladies hanging on your every word, all while you enjoy the power to make, revoke, and enforce laws at your whim, and exercise complete control over vast lands on 5 continents. That's just your normal Tuesday if you're Louis XIV of France, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, who reigned for 72 years as one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Yes, this guy, with the red high heels, the white silk stockings, the fur-lined gown, the lace chapeau, and the 40 hairstylists employed to look after his spectacular array of double-peak, full-bottom wigs for every occasion. The scope of Louis's authority at the height of his reign was so immense that future leaders could only dream of it. His aim was to bring order out of the chaos and upheaval of his time by controlling every aspect of society. He was the very essence of the absolute monarch, endowed with the belief that he ruled by divine right, the idea that God created the monarchy, that the monarchy acted as God's representative on earth, and that the monarchy answered only to God. Now imagine you're a peasant in 17th century France, one of Louis's subjects. You're constantly at the mercy of the king's mood, and if you happen to break a law, you're not just breaking Louis's law, you're breaking God's law. The logic being, if God made Louis king, then to go against Louis would be to go against God. How did one person end up with such extraordinary power? And how did absolutism, a political system in which a single ruler holds complete and unrestrained power over a country, come to be in the first place? Join me in exploring these questions and more as we dive into today's lesson, The Rise of Absolutism. So how did absolute monarchy in Europe come to be? The short answer is that the 17th century was a tumultuous time. Religious and territorial wars between states required governments to maintain permanent armies and impose heavy taxes on the common people, also known as peasants, who weren't fond of this arrangement and often revolted while monarchs tried to impose order by expanding their own power. The longer, more complete answer to how absolute monarchy arose in Europe recognizes that authority had been growing more centralized since the old feudal system began to decline in the late Middle Ages. So first, we need to understand what feudalism really was and how it worked. When you think of feudalism, you probably think of knights, armor, jousting, and chivalry. And maybe you also rightly think of plague, famine, bad teeth, and sudden death. But the real question here is, how did feudal society actually work? Think of feudal Europe as a pyramid based on reciprocity, exchanging things with others for mutual benefit. The idea that I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. The king was at the top of the pyramid. He owned the land and made the laws. Sometimes he'd grant pieces of land or fiefs to influential families, the nobles, expecting something in return: loyalty, money, and an army. To acquire the money, nobles would collect taxes, which would go to the king. To acquire the army, nobles would offer some of their land to professional soldiers, knights, who in return would pledge their army to the nobles and, by extension, to the king. At the bottom of the pyramid were the peasants, who worked the land and provided goods and services to the nobles and knights in return for protection. The feudal system was an example of decentralized power, or power distributed among regional or local authorities, in this case, the nobility. Take a minute to think about this question. When have you used reciprocity in your own life? Why did you and the other party choose to work out this mutual exchange? Explain. Absolutism, which replaced the feudal system, was centralized power to the extreme. That's power concentrated at the highest level. This centralized power generally extended over a much larger geographical area than the feudal monarch's power, often including faraway colonies. And there wasn't much reciprocity involved either. Why? Because one person, the monarch, controlled just about everything. You might ask, but didn't absolute monarchies have nobles and peasants too? Yes, they did. But the real difference between the old feudal system and absolutism rested on the critical question of who controlled the money, and by extension, the army. Under the feudal system, the nobles raised troops from within their own estates, and the king's authority would rest on how many nobles he could persuade to support him. Under absolutism, the king was in full control of a huge, centralized, permanent army loyal only to him. Absolute monarchs like Louis typically sought to replace the power of the nobility with a network of state officials, the bureaucracy, who administered government policy. In fact, Louis built the magnificent Palace of Versailles partly to house the nobles under his own roof so that he could control their influence and keep them dependent on his generosity. Meanwhile, Louis's hand-picked employees, the bureaucracy, managed the noble lands. These absolute rulers didn't stop with control of just the army and the nobility. They sought control of all aspects of life. Louis, for example, had rules about which outfits to wear for different functions. He even rewarded dutiful subjects with the right to imitate his shoe style. More importantly, he sought control over the way people gathered to exchange ideas, how the church was organized in France, and even the way his subjects could and couldn't worship. Take a minute to think about why an absolute ruler, in our modern day, might say a dictator, would want to control the exchange of ideas in their domain. Explain and give an example, real or hypothetical if you can. Religious conflict was arguably the most immediate and significant contributing factor to the rise of absolutism. The Turkish Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, for example, were an ever-present threat to the Catholic Church, as was Protestantism, which arose during the Protestant Reformation, the early 16th century religious reform movement sparked by anger over corruption within the church hierarchy. Few rulers put more time and energy into religious conflict than Philip II of Spain. In fact, if 16th century Europe held a pageant for Mr. Religious War, Philip would be a strong contender. Known ironically as Philip the Prudent, Philip II inherited the Spanish kingdom in 1556, near the height of its glory, flush with gold and silver plundered from the Spanish colonies in the Americas. He could have left it at that and spent the remainder of his life eating grapes and writing poetry in his palace like a normal king, but no. He saw it as his duty to seek out and eliminate anything that threatened the church, and in 1571 he attacked and routed a Turkish Muslim fleet at Lepanto. Then he cracked down on Protestants in Spanish-owned lands in Holland, but they revolted and formed the United Provinces of the Netherlands. You'd think after that Philip would have knocked it off with the religious aggression, but instead he attacked England's Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, sending his Spanish Armada into the English Channel, where it was promptly battered and sent limping back to Spain. The English and Dutch emerged from these wars stronger than before, displacing the Spanish with regard to economic supremacy. Philip, on the other hand, lost his Dutch possessions and went bankrupt trying to pay back the money he owed to the bankers who financed his wars. Now imagine that Philip was the head of state of a modern democratic country. He wants to go on a religious crusade against a neighboring country. What objections do you think the other members of the government would have with this idea? Explain. The problems Philip experienced, religious wars, peasant revolt, bankruptcy, were all emblematic of the conditions that drove later monarchs toward absolutism. Monarchs like Louis XIV, who concentrated power so they could regulate worship, the economy, and the spread of ideas. Absolute monarchy, in effect, turned feudal societies into nation-states, with strict borders and permanent armies along with a common language, culture, religion, and national loyalty. These were, in fact, the beginnings of the modern notion of national identity, quite a far cry from the localized feudal societies of the Middle Ages. In fact, many historians point to this very time as the moment when the modern world began to take shape. And there's so much more to the story. As we move forward, keep looking around you because history is everywhere.
Hey, hey.